Welcome to FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hey everybody, welcome to FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin England. I'm your host, Mike Leon. Ben's a seasoned regulatory attorney and the founder of FDA-Imports.com, where he helps companies around the world navigate the legal maze of the FDA oversight and international trade. Today, we're going to be diving into the recent political shifts, including the return of Trump-era tariffs and the changing landscape of importers, especially those regulated by the FDA. We're also going to discuss the growing role of foreign inspections and what's the latest enforcement patterns that could mean for your business. So, Benjamin, let's get into this at a high level because I love this topic and it's obviously timely with the news cycle that we're in. Tariffs continue playing a significant part in this administration's trade strategy. Are we heading towards broader and more permanent import taxes and harsher rules on foreign goods?
Yeah. Hey, Mike. Good to see you. Thanks so much for having me on. I think the answer is that at least for the next 3.5 years, we're going to see this continue. My feeling is that, and having been in this space for quite some time, particularly in the FDA customs space, that combined space, ordinarily FDA-regulated cargo tends to be sort of exempted from or excluded from a lot of the tariffs. They get built into some of the free trade agreements. It's considered to be sort of more necessary goods as opposed to just commercial commodities, and so they tend to be excluded or have relatively low tariff rates, but that's not true. It hasn't been true in the last 8 months. I don't think that's going to go back. I think that largely what Trump is doing is trying to create a higher floor, where the floor is no longer assumed to be zero and still to be in good tariff relationship with trading relationship with other partners. He wants that floor to be higher and for them to still feel like that they're in a good place as far as the tariffs are concerned. Pharmaceuticals still tend to get a better treatment than other products that FDA or USDA regulates, and that's the space I tend to operate. I used to work for the FDA, so I tend most of my clients are food and drug regulated, FDA regulated clients, and so at the border is where these clients are starting to run into tariff rates that they have never seen before, and they've had to begin to moderate and to make changes. I think in the future, it's going to continue. I think it's going to broaden in the sense it's going to reach into things like pharmaceuticals. It already has in the EU and in India. Others talk about the Indian tariffs also include pharmaceuticals. So I think the answer is yes. You're going to see them. It's going to be harsher. It's going to be harder to deal with these tariffs. The changing environment probably is the hardest thing because companies are doing deals and they're establishing contracts for goods and then on a price, and that price assumes a particular tariff rate, and then that throws them into the wind. So we've been talking to a lot of clients about how to build a contingency language in the contracts in order to deal with those kinds of risks.
Yeah, it's so timely. Obviously, every news segment out there is devoted to tariffs. So many people are looking for this type of information. So very timely and important. We're seeing changes under the Trump administration in terms of what FDA is focusing on its import inspection resources, right? So what should FDA regulated importers be watching closely for right now? What will it mean for them in the coming months?
Companies that are regulated by the FDA are going to see an increase in examination. Although there's a lot of talk about the loss of personnel in the government over the last, say, 7, 8 months due to DOGE or everybody the FDA realizes that they're going to have to put more resources in the inspection process. FDA has been very top-heavy for a very long time, and so a lot of the people where they lost staff were really in the policy levels. They were in sort of the higher regulatory council levels. They were in FOIA, Freedom of Information Act spaces. They were not really sort of decision-making process for the most part, or the inspection process. But RFK and Trump want FDA doing more inspections, interacting more with the trade, and that has resulted in them moving staff to go. More people doing inspections than there were before. They're moving people into those billets and giving them those responsibilities. So FDA-regulated industry can expect to see more inspections, but not inspections that require necessarily a lot of intensive work. more things like labor reviews, document reviews, more technical things at the board. FDA doesn't care about tariffs. They're not paying attention to that at all. FDA is focusing primarily, in fact, exclusively on the regulatory compliance of the goods. That'd be true for USDA, DEA, and other agencies that care about what's coming in.
Ben, let me ask you, what industries are most affected by this increase in the FDA inspection resources and these declarations? And if you can, in what ways are they impacted?
So most of the industries, I would expect the food industry. Okay, the way I would say it would be the percentage of imports that owned by the different FDA regulated industry. The gorilla in the room is food. We import tremendous amount of food from all over the world. So food companies are going to see it. It turns out that food companies, it's not so difficult for the FDA to find problems with respect to food companies or anything else because they do a lot of sampling and testing of food. So FDA is used to that, but those are the industry, right? The industry is very familiar with dealing with the FDA. Cosmetics is not a very large percentage of imported products across other FDA regulated cargo, but they're easy partners because there's a lot of opportunity for mistakes technical mistakes with respect to those products. In the food space, we're seeing things like the FDA is starting to ask questions about additives and about color ingredients and flavorings and those kinds of things. So you're starting to get more inquiry from the FDA, and they're doing this real time with a real entry that's really stuck at port, right? It's like that completely disrupts the supply chain to the extent that your customer is expecting it, in 2 more days, and it's been at the border for the last 2 weeks. It creates tremendous problems. Medical devices, we're seeing a lot of scrutiny on the relationships between the foreign manufacturers and the U.S. importers. And then in pharmaceuticals, FDA seems to be doing a lot of brand protection. They seem to be going after anything that is potentially impacting major pharmaceutical brands. And so you see that in pharmacy compound. That's an area of concern to the branded industry because they feel like it's competitive. And FDA doesn't really like pharmacy compound. So I see FDA going after the active ingredients and the excipients that are imported to go into pharmacy compound.
Daniel Benjamin, it's so apropos for given what everyone is looking for from an information standpoint wise, whether you be a small business owner or even larger businesses, almost everybody has to answer these questions about how tariffs are going to impact in the secondary and tertiary. But let me ask you, because you mentioned some of the agencies there before. So the relationship between the FDA, Customs Border Patrol, is it evolving? Are we seeing more alignment in enforcement actions at the ports of entry?
We are. The agencies are working. They've actually worked together for quite a long time in a pretty good way. But that's at the port. Right? Ordinarily, at the port level, the FDA people and the customs people work together. They know each other. They have each other's phone numbers. When I was in Miami with the FDA for a period of time, I was working at the Customs Clearance Center. Our offices were actually in the customs. We had people in the customs office. We were in the Customs Clearance Center, and we worked with them. We literally had each other's combinations for the offices. And now that was some time ago, but I know that hasn't changed in Miami, and then that has expanded now to Buffalo, Chicago, LAX, JFK. It's in all of the major ports, Dallas, Houston. And so the agencies are working very closely together at the border level. Historically, at the policy at headquarters level, that's where it's not been a divide. They just, customs just has such a larger, they cover everything that comes into the country. And FDA regulates about maybe 36%. So they just, there's always been sort of the bigger brother situation at customs headquarters. But that's changed. These department heads work together better than I've seen in prior administration. So HHS secretary is working more closely with NOM and DHS, which would then the daughter agency or CBP and FDA. So there is more alignment on policy lines as well as operation.
Ben, I want you to expand on something you were mentioning before about maybe some of the issues that are holding up things at the port. What are some of these issues that are triggering these holds or refusals right now? Is it just product safety, or is it paperwork? Is it labeling? Is it something else?
Well, one of the things FDA ran into after there was with the law, there was the RIF. We call it a RIF, right? Basically, they gave people their walking papers, and then that got held up at court. So But what FDA began to do was they began to restrict what the import offices to do in terms of examinations and sampling, primarily samples, because samples cost money. Right? If FDA is going to sample something, they have to send somebody. They have to get it. Technically, they have to pay for that sample if it comes back clean. So there's actually a risk of paying for the good, a portion of the goods. Then it has to go to a laboratory. It has to be tested. Well, that's expensive because there's reagents, there's equipment, there's stat. So what FDA did was they said, listen, when it comes to sampling, we're not going to sample and test for fill, not testing for decomposition. We're not testing for nutritional content, like comparing what's on the label with what in the food. We're going to be looking for contaminants that are health risks. So not pesticides, which are not technically health, even though they're illegal if they're in a food above a tolerance. They're going to look for salmonella, listeria, E. coli, mostly micro testing because that's food based. But then FDA had to make another shift because they were not getting enough samples, and they also were sampling and testing things that they were wasting the resources testing for micro because there's no way to do micro. Like it's almost commercial sterile. So they started then with the label review program. So right now, FDA is intentionally asking for and evaluating the labels of foods, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics, and finding any little thing, and which is I tell clients all the time, let's don't have your shipment held up because of a labeling problem. It's the easiest thing to fix if you just fix it before you ship it, right? Get somebody to look at it. And secondly, it's the easiest thing for FDA to enforce because they don't have to test it. They can just look at it and say, that's misbranded, detain it. And they don't have to do anything else. And that's what they're doing intentionally. So there's a lot of labeling violations that we see. The other thing is we're seeing about 100 new inspectors. They're not new, 100 FDA people moving into the import review and entry process. And they don't know what they're doing. Never done it before. They're not even close to the port. So a guy in Dallas is evaluating something that coming in through San Francisco, Oakland. So they don't know the area. They don't know the industry that uses that port. They don't know the requirements, the rules. They don't know customs and how that works. They had worked for the FDA for maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 years, but never seen this. And so we have a lot of mistakes happening at the border. So that would be sort of like kind of my gripe for the day.
Right. Ben, like I said, the topic couldn't be more apropos. And obviously, I think everybody knows the countries associated with like these high tariffs, whether it be China, and now you mentioned India before, and obviously Mexico. So how should companies that source from countries like China, India, and Mexico be thinking about risk and compliance today compared to last year?
Well, so USMCA, the U.S.-Mexican-Canada agreement, is still in effect. And in fact, there was recently an uptick with respect to what Canada is going to be paying, what's going to be paid on Canadian goods. I think there's 35% on everything except USMCA. USMCA is still covered by, if it complies with that tariff, that agreement, then it comes in according to the terms of that agreement, which usually is duty-free. Well, what does that invite? What that invites is cargo that's not Mexican or Canadian coming in on the back of USMCA. It's actually South American or it's European or it's Asian material that's coming transshipped through Canada or through Mexico. And the Trump administration has basically said, if we catch it doing it, then it's going to be a higher tariff rate. Not to mention the fact that it's considered to be inherited fraudulent activity and they can do penalties. So if you're importing from those countries, you need to make certain that you've got some documentation that demonstrates that it's from those goods, that the origin is Mexican or Canada. It's not so much the cargo's coming from Mexico or Canada, but the origin is Mexican or Canada, according to customs rules. Transshipment doesn't cut it. There's other things that won't cut it. It won't change the origin of the Chinese article or an Indian article into Mexican just because it comes from Mexico. That will be one thing I definitely would look out for. The other thing is do all you can in order to play in the USMCA space. Take advantage of it. Make sure you have your documentation, your origin documentation. You will not be asked for that at entry. Customs won't ask, but they may send you what's called a CF-28. It's a Customs Form 28, which is a request for information where they expect you in 30 days to give you your proof that the goods are the origin it claimed it was. And you're supposed to have it at the point of entry, even though you don't have to give it to customs at the point. With China, it turns out because of all the increased tariff rates, say in the EU and in India, it actually has lessened the pressure on China, even though China's tariff rates haven't dropped since 3 or 4 weeks ago, right? Suddenly their goods are more acceptable because the other goods, which were the go-to when China's rates were high, now became, inaccessible. And so, because they're already were higher in terms of cost. So I would certainly say, you try to look for exclusions, you try to look for legal exceptions, etc. That's coming out of time. But go back to China, other than it is viable. It's more viable than it was 3 weeks ago because of the increase in rates that's happened in Canada, Mexico, India, and EU.
Ben, more FDA inspections, more label reviews, more technical violations. There's going to be more shipments being declared to the FDA. So what would you advise a foreign supplier, an importer, maybe even a downstream distributor? What can they do right now? They're listening to this. They want to learn more. What can they do to protect themselves and their cargo specifically in a more volatile regulatory environment?
Well, I'd be a fool not to say come to FDAImports.com, first of all. Secondly, you can email us at contact@FDAImports.com and ask the question. We'll be happy to see what we can do. But beyond that, importers, I would say that you got to get your labels right. FDA-regulated importers, they have to make sure that the label is right. You cannot rely on the foreign supplier for that because the foreign supplier is not in front of FDA when the good you are. And the FDA is expecting the importer to take responsibility for compliance with the goods. And just throwing it back on your foreign supplier may sound convenient and easy, except for the fact that FDA has import alerts for improper labeling. They have import alerts for improper additives and ingredients in foods that are detected, by the way, on the label. They even have to test it when it's labeled. So the label, you've got to make sure that's right. Your commercial documentation needs to tell a coherent narrative, right? Don't let your documents be confusing to the government when the good get here. If the documents are confusing the government, they're going to stop and start asking questions. And once they start asking questions, they're going to start nitpicking. Third, don't assume the government is right. I say all the time, the government is wrong more than always. Even when they're right, it's for the wrong reason, right? They just get it wrong a lot. And these inspectors are human, and many of them now are new. So don't assume. Read the notice, read the documentation, get help if you need it, but make sure you respond to what they say. That's what my advice would be.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for the insights and analysis on this. We truly appreciate it.
No, great. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It's good to see you. I hope things go well.
And thanks to everybody out there for listening to today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. If your business is facing FDA or customs issues at the border, you want to stay ahead of the curve or the next wave of enforcement, you heard what Benjamin said. You can go visit him over at FDA-Imports.com. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave us a review if you found this information helpful. As always, I'm Mike Leon. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.